Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Our topic today focuses on Israeli evangelical relations, and within that, on faith-based diplomacy, a field of soft power diplomacy most effectively conducted by and on behalf of Israel. We are honored to have with us two leading experts on Christian Zionism and its long-standing relationship with Jews and modern Israel. Speaking to us from Vermont is Professor Shalom Goldman of Middlebury College. And speaking to us from Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan is Professor Jonathana Rynholda. Gentlemen, it's an honor to be able to speak with you. Before introducing each of you further, my name is Philip Steele. I'm a scholar of Christian Zionism and I'm pleased to represent the Three C's Association based here in Warsaw, Poland. Just weeks away in November, we'll be publishing our first issue of our new Foreign Affairs Journal, also entitled Three C's. And one of the main focuses will be on faith-based diplomacy. This is the last in our four-part series on Christian Zionism and the Israeli evangelical relationship. I now wish then to turn back to our guests. First to Professor Shalom Goldman. Over the last years, you've done some of the most seminal writing on the tightly interwoven relationship between Jewish and Christian Zionists. Your book from 2009, Zeal for Zion, right here. Christians, Jews, and the idea of the Promised Land was revelatory for many. In my own case, that particularly regards your portrayal of the close partnerships between, for instance, the Jewish Zionist Naftali Imber and the Christian Zionist Lawrence Oliphant. Likewise, between Theodora Herzla himself and Reverend Williama Hechlera, and also between Professor Józefa Klausnera and Reverend Herbertem Danby'm in the Mandate period. There's a certain echo of Klausnera and Danby's cooperation here in Poland. I'm thinking of the recent scholarly partnership between Father Professor Mariusz Rosik and Rabbi Itzhak Rapaport. Both men are based in Wrocław in southwestern Poland. They jointly wrote a book on an exegetical work on Jewish writings during the time of the biblical period. So, Shalom. Perhaps I can ask you to tell us the fascinating story of Klausnera and Danby's work together.
Yes, that would be a good place to start. Just yesterday, a colleague from Jerusalem sent me a beautiful page of Hebrew writing by the poet Bialik. And he said, Shalom, have you ever seen this? This is such a beautiful language. What is this? Because it came on a website and it didn't have a footnote. I said, oh, that's the most important book of my life. The book that formed me the most. It's called Vayehi Hayom. And it came to pass. This was a book of folktales that Bialik wrote for young people. And he was so successful at this that in the 30s it became a school text in the Yishuv, that is in Jewish Palestine. And the book was soon translated by the Oxford Professor of Hebrew, Herbertem Danby'm, into English. And I found this book on my parents' shelf in the mid-50s and devoured it in English and then wanted to read it in Hebrew. And I read it a few years later in Hebrew. It's a folk tale book. It's something like 1001 Nights of demons, angels, all of the retinue that accompanies King Solomon in his adventures. Many decades later, as a scholar, while I was writing Zeal for Zion, I came across this book again, and I learned the wonderful story of how these two men collaborated. I thought it was simply a translation, but it turned out that Professor Danby'm lived under the British Mandate in Jerusalem. And when Bialik came to live in the Yishuv, that was in the 20s and 30s, he died in the 30s, they forged this very strong friendship. So that to me seemed another example of where Christian interest in Hebrew mapped onto Christian interest in Zionism. Because Danby, who was to become the Oxford Professor of Hebrew, one of the oldest chairs, as my Israeli colleague, my Israeli British colleague knows, one of the oldest chairs in British academic life, the chair of Hebrew at Oxford, became a place for the holder of that chair, Danby, to be a pro-Zionist in British life. I should say, Danby, he's an Anglican cleric, right? So we have a Jewish former yeshiva student who became the Hebrew national poet, and the Anglican cleric expert in Hebrew collaborating on this wonderful project, which I read when I was maybe 10 years old and has influenced my whole life. Here we are 60-something years later, and I'm still delighting in that book. So thank you so much for asking me. It's really coincidental that yesterday sent me that someone, a young scholar, a far better Hebrew scholar than I am, someone in his 40s, sent me this and said, "What is this?" And I said, believe it or not, this is what this is, and I've been reading it for 60 years now. So thank you for the question.
Well, tell us more about Danby's relationship with Klausner as well, if you would.
Yes. So Klausner was an unlikely friend for this British cleric in Jerusalem. So Klausner was an ideologue of what we call revisionist Zionism. That is the group that broke with the Zionist movement about territorial and social questions. And he was a professor of many subjects at Hebrew University. And in the 20s, he wrote a book about Jesus that became deeply influential. It was the beginning of restoring the idea of Jesus the Jew. This might seem like a simple statement. Jesus was a Jew, but for many Christians at the time, it was something of a revolutionary statement. So Danby decided to translate Klausner's book into English and make it an important work that influenced British and American scholarship. And they studied together in what Klausner referred to as their chavruta, their dual study, two individuals trying to master texts, studying together. You know, it's very odd because Klausner was a political conservative and Danby was in many ways a political liberal, but they overcame that in the interest of studying Hebrew. And then they started something that's still deeply influential, which is Jesus the Jew as and you know, there have been many books about this, the revolution in thought about Jesus. And part of that story is an Israeli story. I'll mention one other book, because that's what professors can do, mention books. There's one of the great novels about Jesus was written by an Orthodox Jew in Israel, the Mishol HaTzar, it's called, by a man named Kabak. He was influenced by Klausner, and he wanted to recreate Jesus' story in rabbinic language, kind of fused with modern Hebrew. That's a book I read too, maybe in my 30s, and it's influenced many people in my generation. I have general remarks to make about Christian Zionism, but I'm glad you brought up those two examples because Danby would be an example of an intellectual Christian Zionist. And the people you mentioned, like Hechlera, Herzl's colleague, he was a religious Zionist. Well, this I think will interest our listeners. So Theodora Herzla was a very assimilated Jew, not a practicing Jew in any sense. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of wonderful stories about this, how the rabbi in Budapest came to visit Herzl's family, and his father said, "Rabbi, you have to come back in half an hour." Then he kind of shoved the rabbi out. And the reason was they had to take the Christmas tree out the back door. Okay. Also, kind of more seriously, Herzl and his highly assimilated Jewish wife did not have their son circumcised. And later in life, this caused a deep, profound crisis in the son's life, which actually brought about his disintegration, sort of. So Herzl had this helper, a Christian Zionist named Hechlera, but Herzl thought that Hechlera was far too religious for his own taste. And in his diaries, he says something like, "I can't understand how Hechlera believes that the Bible is true." This to Herzl was inconceivable. But of course, Hechlera was a Zionist because, in the spirit of Christian Zionism, he felt that prophecy, biblical prophecy, was pointing towards the return of the Jews to their land.
Right. That was, in fact, my second question, to ask you about Herzl and, excuse me, and Hechlera's relationship. Sitting here in Warsaw, however, I want to mention that Filip Newliński was another close, for a time, another close Christian Zionist collaborator of Herzl's, and that Newliński opened doors to the Ottoman court and made some connections to Bulgarian and Serbian leaders for Herzl as well. Your most recent book, Starstruck, I got this just about a month ago, published in 2019. In it, you recount the relationship to Israel of leading American stars, particularly from film and from music. I was perhaps most struck by your description of Johnny Cash. In fact,
Yes.
you gave a fuller account in your fine piece in Tablet magazine. That was even 4 or 5 years ago, I think.
Right. The Johnny Cash story keeps growing. Would you say that Johnny Cash is popular in Poland? Or people know of him?
In a certain niche, I would say.
Right.
Country music and or folk rock is a niche matter here.
Right. Well, I'm happy to say that American college-age students in America, they don't know much about the musical culture of previous generations, but they do know Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan. Those are two names they know, and they know their music. So very briefly, because it's a very long, elaborate story, Johnny Cash, who, as Professor Rynhold and I were discussing before we went on air, led a very, shall we say, tumultuous, colorful, difficult life, was addicted to many substances, alcohol, drugs, and generally bad behavior. And then he met the woman he was going to marry, and she told him that only through Jesus and the country of Israel could he rid himself of his demons. And so in 1968, when the Cashas were married, they took their honeymoon in Jerusalem, and they made a recording there. It's called Johnny Cash and the Holy Land. And in that, Johnny Cash travels, it's like a travelogue, through Jerusalem, the Galilee, and all the sites associated with Jesus. And he made this kind of rough but beautiful portrait of Israel through country and Western music. He also reinterprets many of the songs he learned as a child and sings them in a new way. I'll give you an example. In American folklore, and especially in African-American life, crossing the Jordan meant going to the promised land of heaven. Okay? I'm crossing Jordan. That is, I was a good Christian and I'm going to a better life. But Johnny Cash sang these songs on the banks of the Jordan, making it geographically appropriate. And this was also filmed in the 60s and 70s. So the songs that Johnny Cash started singing as a boy when he was 12 years old on his first guitar were the hymns he learned in church. And many of those hymns refer to places in the Holy Land, born in Bethlehem, for example. And I use that as an example of how the idea of Bible Israel, ancient Israel, gets transformed in the mid and second half of 20th century into a political idea, which I'm sure my colleague can, tell us more about. Now, Johnny Cash was 30 years old when he discovered Israel, and for the next 30-something years of his life, he was very devoted to Israel. He took his family there 5 times. And his daughter, Roseanne, who some of your listeners may know, a great songwriter, wrote a beautiful song called Western Wall. I just suggest Googling Roseanne Cash, Western Wall. This song has been covered by dozens of American and European folk singers. A very moving song about a Christian experience of being at the Kotel. So yeah, I actually had planned to write a whole book about Johnny Cash and this question, but I couldn't leave out Frank Sinatra and many other Israel devotees, so I wrote this more general portrait, but I am thinking of going back to Johnny Cash. I'll mention one other thing, that your viewers can see a film called Gospel Road. It's on YouTube, and it's an hour-and-a-half documentary produced by John and his wife, June Carter Cash, in which the story of Jesus is told, is recreated in the Judean desert in Israel. It's kind of hokey, but it was enormously influential in things like Campus Crusade for Christ in the United States. So thanks for asking me about Johnny Cash. It's quite a story. And so his wife, June Carter, and their daughter and son, John Jr., all shared this passion for Israel.
Wow, fascinating. Thanks so much for that response. In that case, I guess it's time now for Professor Jonathana Rynhold to speak to us. Jonathana Rynhold is Professor of Political Science at Bar-Ilan University, and he is the author of the highly authoritative analysis published in 2015, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. Excellent, very influential book for me myself. Put it back here on top of the stack. Professor Rynhold, Jonathan, it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
As everywhere else nowadays, Americans are deeply divided on virtually everything. And that certainly holds true of attitudes towards Israel at large, not simply the waning now, I think we can say, Israeli-Arab conflict. Please describe for us the nature of those divisions up to 2015 when your book came out. And in particular, do you tell us something about the deepest of those divisions, which I think will come as a surprise to many?
Well, it's very nice to be here. I would actually start by saying that Americans are divided about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict, or what policy should be towards the Middle East. They're not divided over Israel per se. So one of the things, if you want to understand why America is so supportive of Israel, you need to understand that American sympathy for Israel precedes mass Jewish emigration from the Russian Empire to the United States. So at the end of the 19th century, before millions of Jews arrive in the United States, when those Jews in the United States are anti-Zionist, right? At that point, there is what's called the Blackstone Memorial, or the Blackstone Petition, in which over 400 leading non-Jewish Americans call for America to help restore the Jewish people to the historic land of Israel. And among the signatories is a Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court, the mayors of the largest cities like New York, Washington, and Boston, the editors of the newspapers in those cities like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, a future president of the US, McKinley, businessmen like Rockefeller and JP Morgan, none of whom are Jew. Mm-hmm. And even today, the overwhelming majority of the American public is sympathetic to Israel. And that is true of Democrats and Republicans in terms of, have they a positive view of Israel? Yes. It's true of every major demographic group, Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans. So that's the first thing. Now, when it comes to divisions, what we see in the last 25 years is that Americans have become divided about the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So on one side, you have Republicans, you have evangelical Christians, and you have Orthodox Jews, yeah, all of whom have become more strongly associated with political support for Israel, particularly vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians, particularly the Israeli right, but not exclusively. And on the other side, you have what we call mainline Protestants, or people of no religion in the United States, two different groups, who have become increasingly sympathetic to the Palestinians and increasingly critical of Israeli policies, whether that's the use of force, whether it's settlement activity in the West Bank and Gaza. And these divisions over policy have become wider and wider between the 1990s and 2015. And I'm going to focus in on the religious divide, which is, and on the one hand, you have American evangelicals, and American evangelicals make up about a quarter of all Americans. So, you know, we're talking about something in the region of 60, 70, maybe million people, right? So that's more people than are in Poland, if you like, right? And these people believe religiously that it's their duty to support the state of Israel. And the foundations of that, I don't know, have you spoken about the foundations of that before, or should I elaborate?
Go ahead, please do, yes.
Okay. So I think there are two religious foundations, one of which is that as Protestants put an emphasis on, in order to understand what God wants of you, you should read the Bible yourself. In order to read the Bible yourself, you need to know Hebrew. Once you learn Hebrew and you start reading the Hebrew Bible, what's sometimes called the Old Testament, then you see it's a story about the children of Israel returning to their, or going to the promised land. And this inspired Christian Zionism. And so you have throughout America hundreds of places named after places in the Bible. And also you have the idea of that the restoration of the Jewish people to their historic homeland is part of the messianic process, which will be part of the second coming of Jesus. So those two ideas are very, very powerful and very popular among American evangelicals. And this gives them very much a pro-Israel inclination. Among what's called mainline Protestants, they are not messianic. They do not believe in general that the state of Israel has significance in terms of any kind of second coming of Jesus. They tend to be more liberal politically than the evangelicals, or at least more moderate politically than the evangelicals. And although the people that go to a mainline church are about average in how they look at Israel, which is, you know, that they are sympathetic to Israel by 2 or 3 to 1, the leadership, the political leadership of the mainline church is very even anti-Zionist. If one was to look at that part of American society, which is very well organized and actually anti-Zionist, then you would look at the organs of the mainline church. Mm-hmm. So they have supported boycott, divestments, and sanctions against Israel.
The Presbyterians, for instance.
The Presbyterians, for instance. Now, if you did a survey of Presbyterians, in the street, then the majority of them would oppose a boycott. But the political leadership of the church is very much in favor. Yeah, so it's a huge difference. Now, they are anti-Zionist for a number of reasons, the leadership. One of which is to do with the fact that from the middle of the 19th century until the early 20th century, they were missionaries. They sent out missionaries to the Middle East, and they set up what is now the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo. And they became intertwined with Arab nationalism, the idea that all the states in the Middle East should be one state with an Arab identity, which is obviously, there is no room for a Jewish state in such a conception. So that's one reason they're historically anti-Zionist. Another is, religious anti-Semitism, the remnants of religious anti-Semitism. So even if they don't formally say that the Jews are a reprobate people, the Jews should not be seen to be succeeding because that contradicts the idea that the church is the new Israel and the like. Though they don't say that, the way that they apply morality to Israel is different from the way they apply it to every other state in the world. Only the Jews have to be weak, only the Jews don't get sovereignty, everybody else gets sovereignty. So those are two reasons. And there are some other reasons, but I think I've probably given you enough to chew on for the time being, and I'm happy to expand if you'd like me to.
Okay. Well, my next question, in fact, concerns the past 5 years since your book came out. The Trump years, in particular, have witnessed remarkable developments in American political culture generally, to put matters lightly, and certainly in U.S.-Israeli ties. So please, Jonathan, tell us about these past Trump years.
Sure. So President Trump has his political strategy is to polarize America, to divide America, to have, and that means he's not trying to win over any group in the middle in order to win. He's trying to get his supporters out. And his biggest group of supporters are evangelical Christians. Now, you might ask, why would a group of people who are personally believe that your personal religiosity and morality is important, why would they support a president whose personal morality is not exactly his best selling point? And the reason that they would do this is because he forwards their agenda in two ways, one of which is to do with issues like abortion that are related to the Supreme Court, and the other is that he's very pro-Israel. And so Trump is the first president to put domestic political interests right at the front of his policy to Israel and the Middle East. It's always a factor, but it's never been so dominant before. So that, I think, is the first difference, right? Nobody has, no previous president has put so much pressure on Muslim or Arab countries to normalize relations with Israel, particularly Sudan, which has happened in the last month. That's very significant. Now, apart from that, what we see is that within the United States, supporters of the Republican Party and supporters of the Democratic Party have never hated each other more. In other words, the levels of hatred are higher than they ever have been. And this means that people who are who are, let's say, Democrats, and they see a policy that's associated with the Republicans, and whatever they might normally consider good or bad, wise or stupid, out the window, and they oppose it because it's associated with President Trump, because it's associated with the Republicans. So in the last 5 years, when you ask Democrats, you know, do you have a favorable view of Israel? The answer is yes. It's always been yes. It's an apolitical question, right? You imagine the country of Israel. Yeah, they're democracy. We like them. As soon as you start asking questions which have a political tone to them, for example, who do you sympathize with more? Do you sympathize more with the Israelis or with the Palestinians, right? And what we see in the last 5 years is a collapse, yeah, among Democrats' sympathy for Israel over the Palestinians. Between, you know, from time immemorial, from the beginning of the State of Israel until 2015, Democrats are more sympathetic to Israel than the Palestinians by at least a margin of 2 to 1, by at least double. In the last 5 years, that's collapsed. And now Democrats are as likely to say they sympathize more with the Palestinians as they are to say they sympathize more with Israel. And this is related to the fact that because President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, are seen as very, very close, yeah? And because Mr. Netanyahu is associated with the Republicans, yeah, his standing and Israeli policy, yeah, and the Israeli government, which is also Israel's most right-wing government for 30 years. So it's, you know, it's also ideologically in a place which Democrats don't identify with. So you take those two things together, ideology and partisan politics, yeah, and this explains the collapse in Democrats' political identification with Israel in the conflict. They've always had arguments about what Israel should do, but they always sympathize more with Israel, and that's gone, and it's because of American domestic politics. So the fact that Trump has come out so strongly on one side has had a whiplash, yeah, effect, a boomerang effect, and has negatively affected Israel's standing with them.
Just in the last 24 hours, there's been a case of Trump's policies vis-a-vis currying evangelical favor in the matter of American passports. I'm sure we've all heard the news that from now on, Americans born in Jerusalem will have Israel placed there as the country of their birth. And until the last 24 hours, that was a thorny issue that no president had acted on. Jonathan, you've led beautifully, of course, into the question we're all asking. Next Tuesday, we have an election, and what's going to happen in the context you've just described with if Biden and Harris win, if the Senate goes Democratic? What's going to happen in terms of U.S.-Israeli relations?
Just let me get my crystal ball out, and then I'll be able to. Okay, so if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win, and if that win is clear and accepted in good time, which may not be the case, yeah? So we've got two ifs there. What do I think will happen? I think that, first of all, Biden has the longest pro-Israel record of any Democrat currently involved in American politics. It goes all the way back to the Yom Kippur War. People questioned whether Obama had a pro-Israel gut, or kishkas in Yiddish, right? There's no doubt that Biden has that. He has a very long record of being pro-Israel in terms of Israeli security, in terms of within the Obama administration, opposing things like when Obama didn't veto the resolution over settlements at the end of 2016. I don't see Biden reversing anything that Trump has done vis-a-vis moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing it Israel's capital, or even the passports. I don't see any change there. I don't think that Biden will pay any attention to the more radical left elements that are critical or anti-Israel. If you look at his teams, he's allowed the left of the party to have quite a significant say over domestic issues in America, like the economy and religion and state and healthcare. He didn't let them in the room when it came to discussing foreign policy in general. So I don't think the commitment to Israeli security or the general sympathy for Israel will be affected. When it comes to policy, there will be an issue on Iran, right? Iran is the most important Israel security issue for Israel and Arab countries. Iran is now several months away from nuclear breakout. Previously, it was a year. The Democrats are committed to re-entering the Iran deal. The Iran deal is not considered good in Israel. There's degrees about how disastrous or how bad it is, but it's not considered a good agreement. And so the terms under which a Biden administration would re-enter the deal are going to cause stress with Israel. The sense in Israel that the Iranians may feel that there's no longer a threat of American military attack, those things are going to cause stress in the relationship. But I imagine it will be managed more smoothly than with Obama. And also I don't expect Biden to, I expect him to take a tougher line than Obama, but a less tough line than Trump. That's how I would put it. On the peace process with the Gulf, he's going to want to roll with that. He's going to want to continue. It's something that actually started before Trump came into office. It's been going since 2014 with the previous administration, with the Obama administration as well. So it's not purely a Trump thing. I think the difference will be that the Biden administration would seek to include the Palestinians. It would want to use its the relations with the Gulf states to try and bring the Palestinians to the table. But if the Palestinians are obtuse, then I don't see the Biden administration investing huge, serious political capital in something they think is going to fail. You know, that if they think it's particularly good, that there's a real chance of a breakthrough, they'll invest in it. If they think it's particularly bad, that is, they think that Israel's about to annex, you know, large parts of the West Bank or has gone on a massive settlement building spree, if Israel pokes the administration in the eye, then you can bet there's going to be trouble, right? Then you can bet there's going to be a lot of argument. But otherwise, those who are, you know, most anti-Israel in the Democratic Party are far more concerned with other issues than Israel. So given that Biden won't let them in on American foreign policy, I don't see there being a huge problem. There will certainly be all the usual shouting and screaming about all the usual issues, but the serious disagreement, the one that has the most implications, will actually be when we get to critical points on Iran. And as for Kamala Harris, we know very little about how she looks at foreign policy. We know that she goes along to the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC. She's not one of the people on the left of the party who avoids AIPAC and only goes to the more left-wing Israel group J Street. We know that while she's liberal in her votes in Congress, she is a prosecutor. That's her background. She prosecutes the bad guys. And, you know, my general sense is that anyone who goes after the bad guys, that's good for Israel in a Middle East context, right? Somebody who has a toughish view, even if they, you know, also, you know, are sympathetic to the underdog, but if they also recognize you have to punish the bad guys, that's probably not such a bad background to come into the Middle East with.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that answer. I wonder, though, what's going to happen, just briefly, if you would, Jonathan, what would you expect to happen with the evangelical pro-Israeli lobby? John Hagee, obviously, is not going to have Biden's ear were Biden to win next week.
No, I mean, but Biden is interesting because Biden's father was an evangelical Christian Zionist. So Biden actually grew up in that kind of a house. It's something that, because America's the most religious society in what we used to call the West, right, in the Cold War, you have many American presidents that are not necessarily that religious themselves, but it's part of their identity. Mm-hmm. President Clinton, his first visit to Israel was with his wife as part of his church cruise. He came with his pastor. So even someone like Biden has much more of some kind of common language with evangelicals. You know, they're going to disagree on everything politically, but emotionally on Israel, they'll actually connect, right? And for the evangelicals, they're less, you know, the leadership of the evangelicals has more sharpened political views, right? That are going to be at odds with Biden on Israel. But for the run-of-the-mill evangelical, anything that's good for Israel, anything that, you know, you see with the peace agreements that have happened with the Gulf, right? The Israeli right doesn't like them because they don't like the idea that they had to not annex parts of the West Bank. But evangelicals say, hey, Trump's brought something good to Israel, fantastic, right? They don't get into the nitty gritty unless you're, you know, one of the activists. So I think Biden, you know, his style is such that he can talk the talk, that there will be the clashes when the evangelicals will back Israel on Iran, they'll back Israel against Biden on anything that's to do with Israel and the Palestinians that they argue about. But it's possible that some of the edge, right, will disappear because Biden's, you know, they share a background. They have much more of a common language. I don't expect them to have, as you say, huge influence over Israel policy. But think of it this way: if you want to do things like to do with sanctions with Iran, you're probably going to need cross-party support, right? Unless the Democrats have a huge majority in both houses. In which case, any kind of bridges that you can build, right, in an incredibly partisan environment, will be vital to Biden. So it may be that they will have some kind of a role, right? The Biden may feel that on some issues that are of concern to Israel, he's going to have to give a bit, in order to get a bit. And so it's possible that they could nonetheless be part of a political dynamic. By no means, having anything like the influence that they have had under Trump, but perhaps not totally marginal either.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. It's been a huge pleasure to speak with Professor Shalom Goldman of Middlebury College in Vermont and with Professor Jonathana Rynholda in Ramat Gan at Bar-Ilan University. A pleasure and an honor, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.